because everybody's just going so slow, kind of nudging their way along, and there's no major collisions because of that. But I think the first picture we have up there, if you could pull that up, Tom, is our missionaries. They actually had just moved. They were in a house previous to this that they were renting. They're renting this one that was a little bit more open, and there would be people who would see that there was the missionary's wife is Caucasian, and they would see that there's a Caucasian in the house, and they would want to visit and ask for money pretty regularly. So they thought that they needed to get a little bit more secluded residence, and so there's kind of like a little bit of a gate in front of the house, a wall in front of the house, and so it's not quite as visible as their previous location. So that's where we stayed most of our time in Manila, which most of our time was in Manila. You can go on to the next slide. Our first 4 days in Manila, so that's the Manila traffic a little bit there. And notice you can see that they're not, they don't enforce traffic seat laws. If they do have traffic seat laws, notice Sam is in the front seat on my lap, which really isn't much of a problem because, like I said, you're going like 5 miles per hour. So if there's an accident, I don't think anybody's going to actually get ejected from a vehicle from a little fender bender at a couple miles per hour. You can move on to the next picture. Okay, this is trying to dry clothes in Manila. Okay, it may seem silly, but it's so humid there, and it's rainy season. In fact, it rained for the first 7 days in Manila when we got there, and I'm talking like constant rain, like not just like dreariness with sprinkle, constant rain with intermittent Noahic-like rain, that just total downpour. And so, when you're trying to, after you've washed clothes, to dry them out, it becomes very difficult. And if clothes stay wet for so long, they get kind of mildewy smell. And so it's always a challenge. That's a domestic challenge, is drying clothes. And so our missionaries would have the clothes in front of fans. And so at this point, there was just a little bit of sun, which anytime there's sun, you want to, run the clothes out. Okay, they can dry out in the sun. And so those are clothes hanging on the line, drying out. Next slide. Okay, so this is me and our missionary and I. I'm trying to teach proper grammar to my children, so I need to exercise it myself. This is our missionary and I. This is Alan Luciano. As we've joked before, if he was from Youngstown, it wouldn't be Luciano, it would be Luciano. But he's not from Youngstown, as you can see. He's actually from the Philippines. You might have been here when they came last fall. And he has kind of a unique story in that he grew up in the Philippines. I think he lived up until his teenage years in the Philippines. His family immigrated to the States, and he had been in the States until probably age 36 or so. And then after he got married, him and his wife went back to the Philippines. That is a very odd story because nobody who comes to the States goes back to the Philippines. Everybody's trying to get here. And so for him to go back is immediately an open door of conversation. Why would you come back here? And it gives them a lot of opportunities to speak about the work that they do as missionaries. Even sometimes when people will come here for theological training with the plan that they'll go back, and then you get a couple years of the nice comforts that we enjoy in the States, and they just don't go back. And so it's a pretty unique story that he goes back. And so this is Alan and I. We're on our way to actually another island. It's called Bacolod, the part of this island that we're headed to. And this is to teach a module at a church where it's kind of like the equivalent of a Bible Institute kind of class where they teach a class on hermeneutics. They teach a class, hermeneutics, how to study the Bible. They teach a class on Old Testament, New Testament survey. They have a Bible doctrine class, and I think maybe one or two other courses. And so some of the students are pastors. Some of them are people involved in discipleship at the church. You can move on to the next slide. And so this is a picture of the class there. Actually, Alan is teaching there. He taught our task when I say a module in these classes, it's basically a three-day kind of intensive where you're teaching like 8 hours a day. And so our task at this point was to teach Old Testament Survey 1, which was Genesis to 2 Samuel, which is a good stretch for me because I'm more accustomed to teaching small portions of Scripture, a couple verses here, a couple verses there, a paragraph here, a sentence there. And so to teach, all of 1st and 2nd Samuel in a couple hours was a good challenge for me to be more concise and try to really work to get the overview of a book. And so Alan tackled the Pentateuch, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then my task was Joshua up through 2 Samuel. You can move on to the next slide. One interesting thing when I was in the class was when I was the picture of Alan when he was teaching. I was sitting in the back of the class, and I noticed that people would be talking while he was teaching, like carrying on conversations. And my initial interpretation of that was, wow, that's pretty rude, people talking while he's teaching. And I didn't understand it until I was up there teaching, okay? And when I was up there teaching, the people who were talking, I was a little bit closer to actually hear what they were talking about. And it was actually the most engaged people who were talking while I was teaching, intermittently, not the whole time, but like intermittently they would look to the other person. And they would be talking about what the content of what was being taught. And so evidently it was just kind of part of the culture where like people often will talk in the midst of teaching, but it's not that they're disengaged and talking about who LeBron's going to play for this year or whatever. They're actually talking about what's being taught and kind of digesting it together. And so I realized that it actually wasn't as rude as what I had initially interpreted it as. It's kind of a neat church that hosted this module. There was about 30 students in this class, and a handful of pastors, but most of the rest were like young professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and so these people had taken off several days of work to basically go to listen to, many hours of Bible instruction. And so it was an encouragement to see that, that's just not normal. I mean, they were sitting on their butts for 8 hours listening to Old Testament survey teaching. And so it was encouraging to see their hunger for God's Word. You can move on to the next slide. Okay, so this is, if you're much familiar with Filipino culture, you have heard of Jollibee's. Jollibee's is it's a fast food chain, and the church. So where I was teaching at previously is kind of like the church office building. This is actually where the church meets on Sundays. They meet inside of a fast food restaurant. There is an event area upstairs at this particular Jollibee's that they basically, they don't even have to rent out. The agreement is that they basically purchase food there for like a fellowship lunch once a month. And it winds up being a real good deal both for them and for the business, because they bring a lot of business on Sunday mornings, because people, you don't have to, have cereal and Sunday morning on your own. You can purchase some Jollibees right before church, and it also gives them a good opportunity to be in the community. And there's a lot of regulars at Jollibees who wind up visiting the church, and they see them every week there. And so I've never preached in a fast food restaurant, and so this was a first for me. And so I'm choking down some coffee ahead of time. I think move on to the next slide. I think it's okay. So notice the shirt that I'm wearing there. I was actually planning on wearing that shirt this morning, but sometimes unpacking isn't an easy task, so I'm not even sure where it's at right now. It's in one of the suitcases and probably needs ironed. But this is called a barong. It's actually, I actually had to purchase it when we got there. It's the equivalent of, almost the equivalent of like a suit. And so if you're going to be preaching or in some kind of formal occasion, you need to be wearing a barong. So I'm wearing a barong there. And that is, I believe, actually inside I think it's inside the Jollibees. Anyways, you can move on to the next one. So these are some of the folks in Bacolod where Alan and I went to teach. So in the front right is the pastor's wife, and behind her is a medical student. And then the pastor is in the far back right. And then there's another pastor in the front left. The brother behind him is an accountant. And then there's Alan and I in the back there. The pastor there, he loves to eat. And he loves to introduce his guests to new foods. And so while I was there, actually his wife who's actually obstetrician, she says that he has a severe allergy to hunger. And so he needs to keep eating to avoid that allergy. And so while I was there, he took me to eat horse tapa, which is horse meat, kind of like a horse jerky. We were at this one particular restaurant. They ordered, on our way in, I looked to my right and I see this really dirty aquarium, like an aquarium looks like, it ain't been cleaned in like 3 years. You can't even see through it. And at some point they ordered catfish, and then of course you see them, pull a catfish out of that aquarium there. And in Filipinos, when they eat fish, that was actually shortly after getting married. That was kind of a culture shock that we're accustomed to not getting acquainted with the animals that we eat. Well, Filipinos don't fillet the fish. It's just kind of head, eyes, everything's all right there, and it's your job to kind of fillet the fish as you eat it. And so, what else did I eat? The one place we went to was called Goat 101, and so they specialized in many different goat dishes, and so we ate goat. It was a goat stew. It was actually goat is the most commonly eaten meat across the globe, but for most of us Americans, we're not accustomed to goat. But this goat was prepared very well. It was more of like a stew kind of thing. But these are just dear brothers and sisters there who are doing good work in Bacolod, and was exciting to be a part of that work that they were doing there. And the pastor, is in the back right, just a very like-minded pastor. He had been to the Shepherds Conference a couple years ago out in Los Angeles that we attend every year. And his name is Pastor Errol. You can move on to the next slide. So this is back in Manila. So I think we're doing Bible time here with 6 little ones. Luciano's, their children are the exact same age as our children, so 8, 6, and 4, but they're all boys. And so the kids had a good time hanging out, and we would try to herd them to the table, do some Bible time with them. Next slide. Okay, this is back in Manila. So the church where Alan is at, even though Alan, a lot of his teaching, he's traveling to different parts of the Philippines, but this is his home church in which he teaches a module every Saturday there. And the church there, the pastor who just became the main teaching pastor, he had been associate pastor for a couple years, and they just kind of went through some transitions, and there's some people within the church who are being very divisive and don't like the pastor, don't like some of what Alan and a couple others at the church are doing with this Bible Institute. And so, I basically come to find out there's a lot of division within the church. And in fact, I was hoping to be able to preach at the church that Sunday, but the pastor had said just with all the turmoil, it'd be better for him to stay in the pulpit. And but I had an opportunity to teach this class on a Saturday morning. It's a 3-hour class. And in God's providence, it was on the book of Philippians. It was a survey of Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Over there, they call it Philemon. And if you're familiar with the book of Philippians, it's, I think one of the major themes is about unity within the church, and that kind of climactic heart of the book is in chapter 2 when Paul says, "Make my joy complete by being of the same mind, the same spirit." In other words, to have unity. And he says to have that through humility, to not, have selfish ambition, vainglory, but to regard yourself with humility of mind. And then he brings in the example of Christ and his humility and servanthood, who being in the very nature of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped, but he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death on the cross. So, here I'm kind of thrown into the lion's den, and I have an opportunity to teach on the importance of unity in the church through humility. And then, if you're familiar with the book of Philemon, it's all about reconciliation and forgiveness between Philemon, who was a slave owner, and Onesimus is a runaway slave, and he runs away to Rome, Onesimus, and happens upon the Apostle Paul, who was instrumental in leading Philemon to the Lord. This is while Paul is on house arrest. And so Paul is instrumental in leading Onesimus to the Lord, but he realizes that there's a rift between Philemon and Onesimus because Onesimus stole some stuff from Philemon, ran away as a runaway slave. And so basically Paul is appealing to Philemon to forgive and to take Onesimus back as a brother. So 2 of the books I was teaching on had to do with themes of, dealing with division, unity in the church, and forgiveness and reconciliation. And so without knowing, who some of the instigators of the division and rifts within the church were, but I knew they were there because afterwards the pastor said they were there. I was able to speak to, without mentioning specifics, but, in Philippians at the end, he mentions Euodia and Syntyche, need to learn to live in harmony together with the Lord. And so I brought that out and mentioned, if there's division, you need to be united and to be reconciled. And so hopefully, prayerfully, I was hoping that the Lord would use the teachings on that to bring some healing and reconciliation within that church. It's always, you think about the Apostle Paul, he says, "Make my joy complete by being of the same mind." So if you think of the opposite of that, in other words, it's grievous to church leaders when there's division in the church, when there's unrest and lack of peace and reconciliation. And so, next slide. So this is me also teaching the same class there in Manila at the home church there. You can move on to the next one. So this is, so after the couple weeks of teaching there, I think this is us on our way to a volcano. It's not, okay, so we're going to a little beach area there in this particular picture, and we were able to go with Alan and his family, and actually his parents and sister were in the Philippines at this time, and so they met up with us. And I'm not sure if you know the story. So Bernie was friends with Alan's sister for years, and it was Alan who came to know the Lord. And then Bernie started asking questions of Alan. So Bernie's been friends with Alan's sister for many years. And then it was actually his parents, when we were still at Grace Community Church, who came to know the Lord. They were in their, I think, late 60s at that time. And so it was a neat time of fellowship with them at the beach there. Next picture. So this is on our way up the volcano. So the kind of a neat background story. There was a pastor who wanted to spend some time with us, him and his wife. So we met his wife about 8 years ago, almost 9 years ago, at a conference. It was a Matthias Media conference at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School outside of Chicago. And at this conference, there was 2 other Filipinos other than my wife, and so Filipinos have a way of magnetizing towards one another. And so we befriended her, and come to find out that her husband was a pastor. We're able to keep in touch with her over the years through social media. And I met her pastor a couple years ago at a Shepherd's Conference. I actually came to Los Angeles. And just a dear brother, very like-minded. His son's name is James Martin. James Martin is his first name and middle name, after 2 of his favorite preachers, James Montgomery Boyce and Martin Lloyd-Jones. So he has some of the same heroes that we have. And so he said, on our way to this volcano, he said, is it okay if we go on a little hike? I thought we'll put the kids on horses, because it might be a little bit steep for them, and us adults will walk up the volcano. Well, so they put the kids on the horses, and so myself and the pastor and his wife and Bernie are walking a little bit behind. Well, the horses our children are on these horses, and there's guides who are, making sure they don't fall off the horse. But they start moving a lot quicker than we are, and in my mind I'm thinking, I don't really feel comfortable not being able to see where these strangers are with our children. And so I'm going to, kind of accelerate on ahead and stay close behind them. That made me leave the other adults behind. And so I get up this first ascent on this. I'm halfway up this first ascent on the volcano, and I'm thinking, there's no way my wife is walking up this volcano. It's just not her thing. And sure enough, eventually, after we all got all the way to the top, the rest of the adults, you see them coming up on horses. So I was the only one who trekked up the volcano on foot. And I paid for it. I mean, I was dripping in sweat. It was a very hot day. The Philippines is very warm and humid, and you're on a volcano that's still an active volcano, and so it's pretty hot. And so, needless to say, I made it up. You can go to the next slide. And so we're actually on the top of the volcano here, and see that kind of huge crater it's like a lake there. That's the top of the volcano that exploded off in 1917. And so it's just pretty impressive to see that much earth moving. I mean, the amount of force to just kind of knock off the top of a mountain is just tremendous. And so that was an amazing thing to see and just to sit and wonder at. But it was also, on the way up, it was somewhat grievous to see they had the Stations of the Cross on the way up. And if you're familiar with some of Roman, Stations of the Cross are typically a thing that Roman Catholics do. Well, they do it in a way to kind of self-atone. People will walk up this mountain on their knees, and go through the Stations of the Cross. And there's some Filipinos who will actually crucify themselves every Easter, and as a way of punishing themselves to self-atone. And so it is a grievous thing to see people trusting in their own suffering rather than the sufferings and resurrection of Christ on the cross. Next slide. Okay, so this is at the Cocoa Beach there. I was able to capture one of the sunsets there, and I think those are some of the kids down below. You can go to the next one also. Next slide. There you go. Yeah, so there you go. The sun's down. So next slide. Okay, this is also at that Cocoa Beach resort area. So we're suffering for the Lord in paradise there. Next slide. Okay, at this point in the trip, we went to go visit some of Bernie's family, and so this was something that was I didn't realize that how close Bernie was to some of these folks. A couple of the uncles there, if you remember, we had been praying for one of the uncles, Tito Andy. He had an aneurysm that needed operated on. There was only one doctor in the Philippines who could do the operation, and we were able to see him, and it was a sweet time. But I didn't realize some of her uncles, when Bernie was young, she lived in Manila, and some of her uncles were going to school in Manila. And as many of you know, Bernie's father was never really part of her life, and so these uncles would babysit, and they would be involved in her life as father figures. And so it was neat to see Bernie able to see them again. It had been, I think, 94 was the last time Bernie had been in the Philippines to see them. And so this area in which we were in, you can move on to the next slide. There was also a beach at this area. It's called Subic Bay. There was a U.S. naval base was here for many years until the early 90s. I think in 92 it moved out. And so a lot of the things that used to be like naval barracks and things like that, had been converted into office buildings and things like that. Next slide. So this is the kids. They're doing some night swimming here at the one. This was a resort we went to in the Subic Bay area. Next slide. And so here we're ministering to the crocodiles, doing some crocodile outreach. The one place in the Subic Bay area is called Zufari, or was that? Yeah, Zufari. So it's kind of like a zoo, but you're like moving around to different spots in the zoo. Like some of it's like open wild animals, and so this is actually like almost like a crocodile farm that we went to. I mean, it was almost it was a little bit disturbing, like to see like over 100 crocodiles in the small pond, like just laying on one another, sleeping. I don't know if they're like harvesting them for something, selling them or what, but we got to hold a baby crocodile, and I love Sam's face with this crocodile. And there was this child from this other family who we didn't know, but he kept wanting to poke the eye of the crocodile, and I'm thinking, like, I really don't want to, even though it's a baby crocodile, I'm not trying to get him upset, but he insisted on wanting to poke the crocodile's eye. Next picture. Okay, so here you would think this is superimposed. I'm pretty sure you can't do this kind of stuff in the States. Here we are feeding the pure milk of the Word to a baby tiger. And he's just on a leash. I mean, the trainer has him on a leash, and he was going to town on this bottle. And in my mind, I'm thinking, like, he's distracted by the bottle. Like, once he realizes, like, there's an entree in front of me, like, he's not going to want that bottle. But we were able to get a picture before. I made a joke. If you're familiar with much of Asian culture, Asian people love to take pictures of their food and post it on social media before they eat it. In my mind, I'm thinking, like, the tiger is taking a picture of us before he eats us. Next slide. Is that it? Okay, so that's all the pictures. So, any questions? Yeah. So the Filipino school system, all their schools teach English, and part of the reason for that is because all the textbooks are in English. There's not many textbooks that are written in Tagalog. Is the kind of typically the more universal first language of the Philippines. So pretty much everybody who's even mildly educated speaks English. Some of them aren't as comfortable speaking English because they wouldn't have done it maybe for many years since they've been out of school, but they do all speak English. And sometimes I notice, like, when the pastors would teach, it would be like 95% English, and then they would throw in some Tagalog here and there. The area we went to with Alan was in Bacolod. They actually spoke a different dialect, and he didn't know it. And so when they would talk with one another, he said, "I'm just as much of a foreigner here as you are. I don't know what they're saying." So pretty much everybody speaks English. But like I said, some it may have been some years before they've spoken much English if they've been out of school. So, like, when we went to the volcano, our guide, I was explaining the gospel, and you could tell there was parts of which he was struggling to understand. So thankfully the other pastor was there to help intercede and explain some of my English Americanisms and whatnot. Good. Any other questions? Chris? Yeah. The instance where we were able to explain the gospel to the tour guide, he seemed to really be engaged with it. There was some instances teaching in Bacolod, talking with some of the students, and just hearing of some of their stories and how the Lord was working in their life. And it was really encouraging to see the church in Bacolod, the pastor there, most of the people there, they've been converted, through his ministry there, or he had discipled. And what it is he teaches like a Bible study at the university there. And then, because his wife is a doctor, he has certain inroads with the medical school there, and he teaches Bible studies on the campus, and then that kind of becomes like a funnel into the church, and so many of them come to know the Lord and then get discipled there and then are part of the church. And so it was really encouraging to see that work going on there in Bacolod, and just the impact of the ministry of the word there. And then to see, it's not a large church. It's probably maybe a little bit larger than our church, maybe about the same size, but they had 30 students, and maybe 5 of them were like pastors from outside, but the rest were mostly young professionals from the church. And to have that large of a group coming out to hear instruction for large blocks of time was real encouraging to see. Yeah. Good. Yeah, Karen.
So the women in those pictures are members of the church. They're not pastors.
Right. Yeah, they're not. Yeah, that would have been awkward. Yeah, they're women at the church involved with discipleship, serving different capacities in the church, and so they were there to get more biblical instruction, to disciple others. Yep. Good. Chris?
Is there any specific
Yeah, I think, at the church there, their home church, just the division there, it's, in some ways it's really exciting. The pastor there, so the track that Alan teaches is a little bit more broad, where you see the ladies in the class and to church members. There's another track that one of the other missionaries is more specific towards pastors and teaching them how to preach and things like that. And so the pastor of the church where Alan is at actually went through the Bible Institute program there, which is neat to see. That's kind of the aim is they're there to train those who are, that's their native area. And so, they're the nationals there, they're the Filipinos there, to train them there. See, it's kind of like a missionary strategy to, like, for me to go to another country, learn another language, learn another culture. I mean, how many years would it take, for me to be able to preach in another language clearly so that people could understand? I mean, 20, 30 years, and still people may struggle to understand what I'm saying. Whereas if you can go to a foreign land and there's already other church leaders there who need more equipping, who you can disciple and pour into, so they who already know the language, know the culture, know the terrain, can do that work. And so they're kind of seeing the fruit of that at the church with this pastor who's a solid brother who's gone through the training program there, the Bible Institute. But there's some people who aren't on board with the same kind of philosophy of ministry, who the church was basically planted from a large mega church at one point that was really into like the church growth movement and programs and numbers and kind of what we talked about with the 3 B's: budgets, buildings, and bodies. And so they're trying to do ministry more biblically minded, but there's kind of an older guard there that, well, why aren't we, I remember the good old days when we had this program and this program and this program. And And so there's a lot of division in the church now because of that, where there's some people who had been there before and, have that mentality of kind of marketing the church, which is sad when I mean, I assume that's an American export, the church growth movement, from the 70s and 80s, and is still in effect today, of marketing the church, has had influence all over the world. And so there's churches who are trying to shake themselves of that and try to be more biblically minded, and it can be divisive. So so that would definitely be a prayer concern, is just pray that people would be on board with wanting to do ministry in a biblical way and not be allured by marketing the church tactics, and that the Lord would help Alan to be a peacemaker in the midst of that. Ron.
Is there persecution there on the government and understand
There's, in general, there is the same kind of religious freedom that we have here. There are some things with when you officially organize as a church, that there's some rules that almost like dictate what kind of church government you can have. And so there is that issue, but by and large, they would have the same kinds of religious freedoms that we have. Most of the persecution would come in the form of Roman Catholicism is so dominant there, and so when persons may leave the Roman Catholic Church, they would experience persecution from family members and whatnot. But by and large, there's not much persecution. There's quite a bit of government corruption at a local level, especially at the local level, mayors and things. It can be pretty nasty. Any other questions, Chris? Yeah, there's actually a cult there that is a fairly influential cult. It's called La Iglesia de Jesucristo. What is it? La Iglesia de Cristo, the Church of Christ, it's called. Which, anytime you hear like the Church of Christ, you kind of have to be cautious. Like, what do you mean, like the Church of Christ? Like, so you guys are the Church of Christ and there's no other churches of Christ? Because usually that actually is the implication, is that we are the only true church. And so it's a cult. I don't know all the specifics of what they believe and teach, but it tends to have quite a impact in the Philippines because they are very much politically involved, and they basically demand that their congregations vote according to whoever the main leader of the cult is. So if he says everybody votes for this, then everybody votes for that. And so because of that, they tend to have kind of a little bit extraordinary influence, because then the politicians will cater to them because they know they're guaranteed this amount of votes if they could swing the church leader in their favor. And so they tend to be catered to. And so there's that. I want to say, like, do you know some of the aberrant teachings of that cult? No, you can't. Right, yeah, and they kind of, because in a lot of people's minds, either you're Catholic or Protestant, they kind of get lumped in with other Protestants, even though they're not Protestant in any kind of historical sense of Protestant convictions. Yeah, for the sake of the recording, yeah, there's a heavy mix of superstition and Mary worship and saint worship that's more explicit and overt than you might see here in the States, which seems to be fairly common in a lot of other countries. Like if you go to Mexico, like they'll have, like what is that kind of Santa Nino, the baby Jesus. So they'll have a parade where people are going kissing this little statue of a baby Jesus, and just it's a lot of superstition as well. Like what was the thing your aunt was saying about it was a fish. They kept a fish because they thought it had some influence in healing. Bernie's uncle. He was just like, okay. Karen.
What were some of the questions they asked you about us, United States, this church? What were they interested in?
How you have to pick up your tray, clean up after yourself at a fast food restaurant. No, that's a funny kind of little thing where, like any of the fast food restaurants, you're supposed to just leave your stuff there, and somebody else comes and cleans up after you. Takes a while getting accustomed to. What else? Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot that I can remember. Trying to think what else. Yeah, I can't remember questions that were asked about that. I think they're probably because of TV and things like that. They're fairly familiar with a lot of American culture. John? Yeah, so they have it's a kind of a democracy. I'm not sure if you're familiar with their President Duarte. He probably has the same amount of brashness, maybe more than our current president, which is kind of shocking. In fact, that you may remember. Yeah, I mean, Obama wouldn't even visit him because he would basically name call Obama. And I won't even tell you what he called him, or Secretary of State Kerry. You can look it up online if you're really that curious. But some choice words for them. He tends to he evidently he was like a sheriff at some point, and he's kind of like a no nonsense, heavy force kind of police guy. And so he's kind of been known for like, okay, we're going to deal with this drug problem and no nonsense, no exceptions. We're going to, arrest people. And he's been taken as being very heavy-handed in that. But for many years, Philippines has been kind of noted for a lot of its governmental corruption at the federal level. If you remember Marcos and his wife for many years, but he would call what martial law every time there was supposed to be an election. He would declare martial law so they couldn't have an election. And then there was that People's War, peaceful protest at some point. But so as far as I can tell, at least talking with our missionaries, at the federal level, there's not as much governmental corruption as there used to be, but it's still at the local level. It's still at the local level. Yeah. Well.
The materials that you gave, the books and stuff, did that go to the seminarians or when you went off that other island with Alan?
Yeah, so some of the resources went to the students in that class, a book on discipleship that I thought would be helpful, just encouraging the students to be involved in discipleship. And then some of the other books that were more geared towards preaching went to kind of the other branch of the Institute that's more focused on pastors. And so David Helm's book, Expository Preaching, and then the other book, Saving Eutychus, another book on preaching, how not to put people to sleep while you're preaching and kill them. That's where those, and it was really neat to see also like Crossway Publishers, they donate English Standard Version MacArthur Study Bibles to all the students in their modules. And so like the classes that I taught, they all had MacArthur Study Bible. And so I was able to use that kind of as a textbook for the introductory material from the different books that we're teaching on. And so that was real encouraging to see publishing house serving these missionaries overseas and the work that they're doing by providing a lot of Bibles for free. Okay. Well, I think we're about out of time, but if you have any more questions, yes, Bernie. Yeah, we have a theory that, or maybe we could implement this in public policy. Anybody who complains about this country needs to leave for a month and and see how much they complain after they've come back. It's true. I mean, when you leave this country, anytime I've left, you come back with different eyes, to realize that we really have a lot in this country, a lot to be thankful for. And I mean, everything from, people complain about police brutality or corruption in this country. They have no idea. Like in other countries, it's like you run from the police. Other countries, the mentality is to look to the government for, in this country, the mentality is you look for the government to help you, to save you. Other countries, you run from the government. And so there is a reason why, millions of people are trying to get into this country. And it's not that other country, that Philippines doesn't have some wonderful things, but, hot water is nice. Showers are nice. Yeah, toilet paper is a blessing. Toilet seats are a gift from the Lord. Well, let me close in prayer. Lord God Almighty, we come before you, and we, in many ways, live like kings of many other generations and many other countries, and you have richly given. And in the midst of the affluence, we can suffer from some affluenza, and forget to be thankful and forget to appreciate what we have. And Lord, I thank you for the work that you are doing in the Philippines. I thank you for Alan and Sandy, the sacrifices that they have made to be involved, to help churches in the Philippines. And I pray that you would be glorified through the work there, and just may it continue on and thrive and flourish. Pray for Pastor Errol and the work that he's doing, that you would be glorified in that. And Lord, we just I thank you also for just the folks here at Sovereign Grace who have prayed, who have helped contribute to make this trip possible. I thank you for them. And Lord, we just say this all in Christ's name. Amen.